All right, everyone. Welcome back to the Higher Education Power BI User Group. I'm your host for March 2025, Pete Benbow at Davidson College. Welcome, everyone, back to another edition of our favorite little data-centric user group. I hope you enjoyed the music. That was, of course, the theme to Superman, the movie from 1978 by the amazing John Williams. I wanted to do that in honor of the late Gene Hackman, who sadly passed away uh, several days ago, and who, of course, played Lex Luthor in that movie. So, anyway, I hope you enjoyed the music. On to the show. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, the mission of the Higher Ed Power BI User Group is to train, educate, and connect data professionals who work with Microsoft Power BI and Microsoft Fabric at colleges and universities, not just in the United States, but across the globe. After the meeting, look out for an email that's containing links to our YouTube channel where we send all of our recordings of previous meetings, a link to our Slack workspace where we keep the conversation going outside of these monthly meetups. Also, some links to submit an idea for a topic or speaker, or to volunteer to speak at an upcoming event, or to RSVP for our next meeting, which is, to be determined at this point. So we'll send that out shortly after the meeting. As per usual, I'm going to do my quick update on where we are in terms of Power BI versions. That should say February 2025. Let me fix that right quick. We are currently on February 2025 if you're using the Power BI service, and if you're using Power BI Report Server, we're on January 2025. In the message after the meeting, I will put out a couple of blog posts that summarize the latest features in the February 2025 cloud version and the January 2025 on-premises version. So look forward to that. A couple of quick announcements. First of all, I am very grateful to welcome Ambreen Hassan, who is the Director of Institutional Research at Youngstown State University. She's going to be joining the leadership team for this user group. I believe that she and James made a connection recently, and he invited her to join the team, and we are very grateful to have her expertise and experience added to this user group. So thank you, Ambreen. We look forward to your excellent leadership in the coming months. One more announcement of a similar sort. I am going to be stepping down from the leadership team of the user group. I founded this user group in August of 2023, I think it was, and since that time, I've taken on a faculty role at Davidson, and I would like to dedicate more time to teaching, writing, and research. So this month will be sort of my last month in an active role with the Higher Ed Power BI user group. I'll be turning over the reins to James, Jeff, and Ambreen, and anyone else who joins the leadership team. So I just want to thank everyone. This has been a really cool experience, taking the user group from 0 people in August of 2023 to almost 1,000 people as of this month. We're not sure how many of those members are bots or actual, real people. Ever since we took the group public a couple of months ago, but the group has grown a lot. We've gotten a lot of great presenters, and so I just want to say thanks to everyone who has kind of helped me get this group off the ground, and I'm very happy to be turning over control to the rest of the leadership team after this month. I will iterate a call for speakers, which is we're particularly looking for people who have experience with either implementing or who have already implemented Microsoft Fabric. We've been talking about putting together a panel of speakers from different higher ed institutions who can speak to what their institution wants to get out of Microsoft Fabric or what you have gotten out of Fabric. We've been using it here at Davidson for several months. I know there are other institutions out there like Elon University, and I think the University of Miami is using it to some extent. And so we're looking to put together a group who are willing to get together on Zoom and do a virtual panel where we talk about Fabric and the various features, some pitfalls that you may have encountered, the benefits of using it. So if that describes you, if your institution is using Fabric or thinking of using Fabric, please reach out to us. Reach out to us via Slack or email or Meetup messages, whatever the case. But we would love to hear from you and put together a panel like that. All right, So, without further ado, I'm going to switch over now to today's topic, which is the DAX Query View. So, this is a fairly recent addition to Power BI Desktop. DAX Query View launched as a preview feature in desktop in November of 2023, I think roughly when it came out. And in contrast to a lot of preview features in Power BI Desktop, which end up sort of sitting in what I like to call preview purgatory for several years, DAX Query View actually got promoted from preview to generally available pretty quickly. It was made generally available as of May 2024, so it is now a standard feature in Power BI Desktop. You don't need to opt into it or anything like that. And just recently, within the last 6 months, I believe, it's also been added as a feature in the Power BI service. So if you want to modify DAX queries and modify your measures inside of the Power BI service up in the cloud, you can totally do that. And I'll go into that a little bit as we go into this demonstration. I'll show you how to access the query view inside of Power BI Desktop and inside of the Power BI service. So why is DAX Query View a big deal? Why are we dedicating a whole session to this one feature of Power BI? So I'd like to start by giving you some context, and I tend to think of Power BI as a series of layers. If you think of your data source or data sources as one layer, and we pull data from those data sources into a semantic model, and that would be the next layer. And then we pull that data from the semantic model into a report, which would be the third and final layer. When you think about it in terms of layers, and you think about a Power BI semantic model that runs in import mode, when you load the data from your data sources into that data model, it persists in memory as part of this in-memory database based on the technology that SQL Server Analysis Services uses. It runs in memory for fast access to and from the report layer. And so when that data is brought into that semantic model, and you go in and you change a page, or you update a slicer, or you filter a visual, you add a calculation, what's going on behind the scenes is your report is issuing a query to that semantic model in the same way that when you query a SQL database, you're issuing a query to the database engine. Well, your Power BI report is doing much the same thing with the semantic model, and the language that it's using to query that data from the in-memory semantic model is DAX. And you may not be aware of that because if you've only used Power BI for a little bit, you're probably familiar with DAX as the main language for creating calculated columns and measures. But in truth, DAX is really a lot more than that. I like to describe it as the connective tissue that makes Power BI actually work as a full-fledged platform, because it makes that connection from the report layer to the semantic layer. And as we'll see today, when you make these changes, like loading a different page or clicking on a slicer, and you use the performance analyzer feature in Power BI Desktop to capture what's happening behind the scenes, you'll see that Power BI is actually issuing these DAX queries. And we can look at those DAX queries inside of the DAX Query View inside of Power BI Desktop and get a glimpse into what Power BI is actually doing. Not only that, but it also gives us the ability to customize and modify a lot of our data model through scripting and much better sort of text-based editing than what we normally do when we're working with calculated columns and measures inside of the standard Power BI desktop interface. To kind of describe some of that, James and I have got some demonstrations to go through. It's going to showcase a lot of this. What I'll point out to you is basically two main benefits to using DAX Query View. Number one, as I mentioned a second ago, it gives us that window into the inner workings of Power BI, particularly the reports and the semantic models. But also, as you'll see, it gives us a really great interface that allows us to explore and customize the semantic model itself, particularly the calculated columns and measures. So we'll go into that. One last thing before I jump into Power BI Desktop is that prior to having the data query view, some of you may be familiar with another tool that's out there called DAX Studio, which is a free third-party application that integrates directly with Power BI Desktop, and you can also use it to connect to your semantic models that are hosted either in the Power BI service Or if you're running SQL Server analysis services on premises, you can also connect to data models that way. So DAX Studio has been around for years. I teach DAX Studio as part of my course on Power BI on edX, and it still plays a very important role in the Power BI ecosystem because DAX Query View doesn't totally replace DAX Studio, but it does take a lot of the utility that we get out of DAX Studio, particularly its ability to query a semantic model with raw DAX code, and it moves that functionality into Power BI Desktop and makes for a more seamless experience if you are someone ambitious who really wants to get in there and actually learn how to write DAX queries. And there are some benefits to writing DAX queries, in particular if you are ever creating paginated reports in the Power BI service. The DAX Query View can be really advantageous because you can create DAX queries and then paste those into the paginated report builder. And so you're writing DAX queries, putting them in paginated reports, connecting to the same data models that your Power BI non-paginated reports are connected to. And so that can be really, really beneficial, especially for keeping a really streamlined workspace where you've got multiple reports all connected to a single semantic model or a streamlined subset of semantic models. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is I'm going to transition over to Power BI Desktop, where I have got a demonstration file ready for us. This is a PBIX file that I sent out to everyone who RSVP'd yes to this meeting about 30 minutes ago. So you should have gotten the email, and you can download the PBIX file from my Google Drive and follow along if you want to. I've rebranded it a little bit. This comes to us from James. James put together this file for his Data Dojo and gave me permission to go in and make some tweaks to sort of rebrand it for this user group. And so what we can do is we can kind of go through this and kind of showcase what the DAX Query View does. Now, as I mentioned, DAX Query View is generally available. So as long as you are on a version of Power BI Desktop that is at least May 2024, I believe, you should already have DAX Query View as part of Power BI Desktop. If you are using an older version of Power BI Desktop, well, first of all, you should probably upgrade. But if you haven't upgraded yet, what you can also do is you go into Options and Settings, you can go to Options and you can enable this, what used to be a preview feature. You go to Preview Features, and somewhere in this list of of preview features, it will be buried in there. But if you're on a more recent version of Power BI Desktop, you should not have to go through that process. And if you're wondering where DAX Query View is, I had it up on my screen a minute ago, but over on the left-hand side of Power BI Desktop, you've got the report view, you've got the data view or the table view, you've got the model view that allows you to see the table structure or the schema of your semantic model. And then I've also got a fourth button down here called DAX Query View. I've also got a fifth button over here for the Tyndall view, but we're going to ignore that because that's not really relevant to today's thing. But I've got the DAX Query View embedded inside of PBI Desktop. And when I click on this, it's going to take me into this view, and I'll point out a few things. First of all, we have a ribbon along the top, the very top of the query view, like we have a ribbon in all other parts of Power BI Desktop. There are a few buttons here, such as Format Query, Uncomment or Comment Lines, Find, Replace, and there is a command palette. We'll come back to the command palette because it's one of my favorite features of the DAX Query View. We've got a little bit of there's a gray banner here that says DAX queries will be saved to your model. They won't be visible when published in the Power BI service. I'm going to click that to get rid of it. Over on the right-hand side, I've got a data panel, which gives me a list of all of the tables in our semantic model, which of course I can expand if I want to see all of my measures or all of the columns that are featured in this model. There's also within here the model tab where you can see a list of all the measures, relationships, everything that goes into this semantic model. Most everything. It's not a complete view of everything that's in there, but it is a streamlined view of a lot of the different relationships, tables, and so on that go into your semantic model. You'll also notice that there's this little glimpse feature over on the right-hand side, which is sort of a shrunken down glimpse of our code We've got about 158 lines of DAX code here, and we can scroll through this using this little feature on the right-hand side. On the bottom part, we've got a query results panel, and there is a green run button in the upper left corner of the DAX Query View. So if I go in and run this query, which this is pre-staged, this query is, you'll see along the bottom of the bottom of the query view, there's a series of tabs. These tabs are actually built into this template. James added these to give you a way to see the to see the metadata of the model itself. This one's called Vertipack tables. And if I run this query, which is baked into this user group demo, if I run the query, I get my results down below, which is just a list of all of the tables that are in this data model. So this query, this DAX query that you see right here, is going out, it's retrieving all of this metadata, it's getting the total size of every column, it's getting the number of rows, it's getting the size of the dictionary, which is sort of the compressed object that kind of has all that data, the percentage that each table makes up of the overall size of the semantic model, and a rough estimate of the cardinality of these tables. So you can see all this information in this bottom portion right here. And we've got a few features we can play with, but this is the DAX query view, and you can kind of see the function of DAX. We've got some variables that are being declared. We've got copious commenting happening throughout. And then down at the bottom, we should also see an evaluate statement, which is going to return the results of this query. So this is an example of what you would see inside of DAX Query View. But let's go for something that's a little more direct with what is going on inside of the report itself. This is just retrieving some metadata. But if I go back to the report and I go over to, say, demo page 1, we've got some visuals here. We've got a couple of charts. We've got a table. We've got a column chart. We've got a couple of slicers going on. And what I'd like to do to kind of showcase what the DAX Query View is actually doing is I'm going to go to my View panel, and I'm going to turn on the Performance Analyzer. Actually, the Performance Analyzer is already turned on, so I'm just going to open it up on my right-hand panel here, and I'm going to start recording. And once I've started recording, anything that I do, any interaction that I make with the Power BI report is going to get recorded in this panel. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select a year from my slicer, and you'll see that when I do that, the Performance Analyzer populates with several rows of data. And to just further demonstrate, I'll also select France from the country slicer, and we can see more data populates. When we look at the Performance Analyzer data itself, you'll see that there are some subheadings in here. Like there's one that says changed a slicer on year 2. So we're capturing that event where I clicked on something. And we'll also see this if I click on one of my tables. Like if I click on this VTT record in my column chart, we will also get more information in the Performance Analyzer where it says that we cross-highlighted the visuals on this page by virtue of me clicking on that column chart. So the Performance Analyzer is capturing those interactions. And what happens when we do that, if I look at a particular visual, like the total units sold by product visual, if I expand this, I'm going to get several things in here. And first of all, I'm going to try to zoom in on this. Maybe it might make it a little bit easier to see. If I zoom in on this, you'll see that there's a line for DAX query, there's a line for visual display, and there's a line for other. So it's giving me in milliseconds the time it takes for that particular visual to retrieve the data that it needs from the semantic model and then render that visual after I've made those selections. And there are a couple of buttons here. First of all, there's a copy query button. So if I copy that query and then maybe open up a blank page or something like that and drop in a text box, I can then paste that query content directly in here like so. All right, so I can copy the query content like I just did, but if I really want to take this a step further, I'm going to delete that page. I'm going to go back to my Performance Analyzer. There's also a button that says Run in DAX Query View, which I'm kind of circling right here. And if I select this option to run in DAX Query View, it's going to open up in DAX Query View that exact same query that just ran to filter the data on the year 2024. So you can see at the start of this, there is a define header on line 1, and within there, we're defining a variable called ds0 filter table, where we actually filter our date dimension on every record where the year is equal to 2024. And we then take that information and bring it down into our subsequent DAX query functions. And we can then take this and run it, and this retrieves data down below that you can see here. So we can actually look at the code that is generated by each particular Power BI visual, and we can even look at the results that are generated or that are returned from the semantic model when we do something like changing a slicer or cross-highlighting a visual or whatever, including changing pages and things like that. So there's a lot of capability in here. We can also, to give you a few more examples, if I want to look at a particular table like dim country, for example, I can highlight or right-click on dim country, and then there's an option within the query view to go to quick queries. And within quick queries, we have multiple options we can choose from. For instance, I can say, show me the top 100 rows of our dim country table. And if I hit that, it's going to open up another query tab down below on that bottom row below the query view. And it gives me a new DAX query, like you see here. And when I look at the results, I also see that it gives me 5 rows of Canada, France, Germany, Mexico, and the USA right here inside of our results panel. And maybe I can go do the same thing for product. Quick queries, show top 100 rows, and there's only 6 products, so that doesn't really demonstrate a whole lot. But the ability to just go through and right click and glimpse at the contents of a table in your semantic model using that select top 100 rows, it reminds me very much of the same functionality in like SQL Server Management Studio or a basic SQL editor from Microsoft. You can go through and say select top 100 or select top 1000 rows from a table in your SQL database. So it's very much like that. If I right click on dim country, I can also click this option for show column statistics. So if I click on column statistics, it's going to give me, as you can see down below, a summary of the columns that are in this table. So we have a count of the number of rows in each column, the number of distinct values, the number of null values, the min value, the max value, the median. So it's basically a big summary statistic table, just showing basic summary stats like mean, standard deviation, the number of zeros, the number of even numbers, odd numbers. It goes on and on and on. So you can look at some basics that help you kind of understand the granularity of the data that you're working with and potentially the cardinality of some of your columns. Maybe you're running into performance issues when you try to filter on a particular column. And maybe the reason you're running into performance issues when you look at the summary stats is because you're trying to filter on a column that has a very high cardinality. And maybe it's connected to another table with similar high cardinality. And so maybe you're doing a lot of filtering between these high cardinality columns that could be impacting your performance. So looking at these summary statistics is another kind of neat feature of the DAX Query View. A couple more things I'm going to demonstrate. There's also a define new measure feature right here. If I go to my measures table and go to quick queries and say define new measure, it will give me a blank template, a starter template for me to go in and start messing like writing a new measure from scratch. So it's different from the formula bar approach. If I go back to the report view or the model view, I can create a new measure and it will give me the standard DAX formula bar. But with this, as you'll see in a couple of minutes here, this is, in my opinion, a more potentially more user-friendly interface in some ways, but also when you start dealing with multiple measures at once, this interface becomes extremely helpful. So to that point, if I go back to my measures table, there's an option under quick queries to define all measures in this table. And if I click that option, this is going to script out every single measure in my measures table. Now, why would we want to do this? Why would we want to script out every single measure? So first of all, from my standpoint, as someone who's been working with Power BI for 8 years, oftentimes when you're going in and adding a new measure or modifying an existing measure, you go in and you make a tweak, like you rename it or you change a measure reference or a column reference, And then typically you hit the check mark or you hit enter to commit those changes. And usually there's a period of several seconds where everything is recalculating. And if you're doing this kind of editing across multiple measures, like you're talking like dozens of measures perhaps, because there are some semantic models out there that can have dozens, even hundreds of measures, that gets really tedious. Like doing that one by one, measure by measure can take a lot of time. So the nice thing about DAX Query View, or one of the nice things, is that if you need to edit a lot of measures at once, what you can do is you can go into this define all measures view, and you can go in and you can make those adjustments in this script. And then when you're ready, you can update all of those measures at once without having to go through and update them one by one. So in the upper left corner, you'll see there's a green run button, but there's also a update model with changes button. So you can go through and script all your changes and then hit that button and apply everything at once instead of going through and running through that tedious process that I just described, where you do it one by one and then you wait for the calculations to run. So this can be really great for large data models. If I go in, if something gets broken because something got renamed, like in Power Query or something like that, and that is, that's a breaking change that's cascaded through my data model, I can go through and use this feature to remedy those changes a lot more quickly than I otherwise would. There's also another feature in here. If I right click, go to quick queries, that is define all measures in this model. So if you have a model where your measures are split across multiple tables, which is fine. It's pretty common convention nowadays for people to put their measures on a single table, or at least a couple of tables. But if you've got your measures spread out across a lot of tables, then you can hit this button that says define all measures in this model. And that will do, in this case, it'll do, because I've got a measures table and a utilities table here, it will define all of the measures across all tables in the data model. So that's a really helpful feature as well. Again, when you're dealing with large models where maybe you have a lot of dependencies between your measures and you need to do these fixes quickly, this can be a real time saver, quite honestly. So there's a lot that you can do with DAX Query View. So at this point, James, have I missed anything that you think I should address? Or do you want to switch over to your part of the demo?
I've actually been fielding questions in the chat most of this time, so I've been I thought I'd just let you take the demo and I would take the questions. So
All right. So this is the point where, if we don't have any open questions, maybe we can switch control over to, and you can maybe demonstrate like the scripting. What was the part you were going to do? Go to my notes real quick, but we're going to have you look at part of this demonstration for so maybe explaining the information views, or maybe doing test cases, or replacing. No, yeah, I don't know what, like, if there's anything you think that I missed that you'd like to demonstrate, or
I don't have a way to demonstrate the test cases, but we can at least talk about it a little bit. So
okay.
I think one of the things that makes DAX Query View an important feature for particularly for teams of Power BI developers is that when you're developing a report or semantic model, oftentimes you're making changes, and there will be parts of that that are already set in stone that have been working for a long time, and then you could make a change that might break something that was already working before, but you might not notice that it broke because there's just so many things already there, and you can't look at every single thing and know whether it's correct or not. So one of the things you can do with DAX Query View is to write some tests. Basically, what you probably will have is historical data, which this is historical data in your model shouldn't change. Once you go back beyond a certain threshold where probably a certain window, maybe the last month or two, where some records in your database might get updated. But after a certain point, most databases will say, all right, the data that's older than this threshold is pretty much fixed. What you can do with that is you can say, well, when you know that the semantic model is in a state where everything is working properly, what you can do is say, all right, well, now I'm going to go in, I'm going to find out, all right, what should I expect the value of this measure to return if I query it with the model in its proper state. And if you know that measure should return that value for that range of dates, then you can basically write that as a DAX query and have it test to see if the results of that query match that value. And if they don't, then you can return fail. Otherwise, they return pass, right? And so you can do that as a combination of all your measures. You can even have it check to make sure that like if you have a table that you expect to have certain columns and one of those columns disappears, you can have that's called schema validation. So you can have it check to see that all those columns are there. You can have it look at the minimum and maximum values to see if maybe somebody made a change where the values of the measure is the same most of the time, but like under certain circumstances, it's going to be different because the minimum maximum value, or some data has been cut off somewhere. There's lots of ways you can put tests in place. And the nice thing about DAX Query View is that or one of the nice things about it is that when you save when you have these tabs at the bottom here, those become part of the PBIX file, or PBIP if you're saving as in the Power BI project format, and you can just rely on those always being there. So when you're sharing these files between you and your coworkers in a BI team, or possibly even in a distributed kind of manner throughout an organization, one person who saves those tabs, the next person can just open it up when they're working on it, and then they can go to those tabs and just run the query and check to make sure that the results are returned with all pass. And that is a good way to avoid a situation that we refer to as a regression, where something that was working no longer works after an update, and those are called regression tests. So it's a nice way to make sure that things will continue working the way you want them to.
Yeah. I think that, DAX Query View and then the Tyndall view that I mentioned at the start of this, those are features that are, when you talk about things like regression testing your Power BI files and being able to look at the underlying DAX queries and the underlying schema of the data model itself via the Tyndall view, there are a lot of advancements that Microsoft is making that brings the world of Power BI a lot closer to the world of legitimate, like, I guess, software engineering. Like, it's much more the ability to go in and look at the schema and understand what the query is doing. Now, this is, these are technical subjects for sure, but if you are someone who has worked a lot with, testing and debugging business intelligence products like this before, these kinds of features are incredibly useful, especially in large enterprise BI teams, which I know some of us have, but also in smaller shops as well. There's a question from Karen Harker. Is it better to house all measures in a measures table or to store them in the data source that it is most related to? And I think that opinions on this differ. I have always sort of been in favor of putting your measures on the measures table, like you see here. Usually what I do is exactly what James's file has here, is I'll create a table called underscore measures. The underscore helps it to stay alphabetically at the top of the list. And then you put all your measures in there, and you can organize your measures into folders, as you see here. And that allows you to keep all of your measures sort of, nicely condensed in one place where they're easy to find. There are some downsides to this approach, though. For one thing, if you start to get into the world of connecting Microsoft Excel to your semantic models, you might be familiar with the ability to actually, when you connect an Excel file to a semantic model, there's an ability when you double click on a pivot table in that Excel file, it will drill down into the detail records that cell of the pivot table corresponds to. It's a really cool feature. I love it. However, that only works if the measure that you've put into that pivot table cell is on the table that you want it to drill down into. If it's on its own measure table, it doesn't work. You have to actually define a DAX query for that measure that gives it what columns you want to retrieve whenever someone double clicks on that measure inside of Excel. I can't remember the name of that property in the data model, but there's actually a property that every measure has where you can define that DAX query, and then it tells you like what data to return if someone tries to drill down. I think maybe it might be called like drill down query or something like that. Um, but that's one downside to using a measure table is you have to go through and explicitly define that query. If you don't do that, then you can just drill down to whatever table that measure is stored on. So I think it's kind of a toss-up. I think the conventional wisdom seems to be that the best practice is to put measures on their own table. But I sometimes think that it's whatever works best for your organization.
I think one of the big deciding factors there is that if you have users who are doing a live connection to your data model in Power BI Desktop, where they're creating their own reports, or they're connecting to it from Excel using the pivot table method, it's a lot easier to find what they're looking for if all the measures are right there in the measure table. Just from the standpoint of ease of use for someone who's coming to your model and trying to answer business questions, if you have things organized in an easy, like, okay, well, I know that here's the dimensions. I'm going to put those in my, sort of categories, and the measures I put those on, where I want it to actually summarize the data. If you're doing a pivot table, I think it's just easier in those kind of circumstances. But in your, like Pete said, it's going to vary based on your organization and the intended use of the model. So there really isn't a right or wrong answer to that. It's whatever works the best for the specific situation.
Yeah. Real quick, I'll also show you DAX Query View in the Power BI service. So I'm connected to a Fabric workspace that we have here at Davidson that's bringing in a bunch of budget data from our Oracle ERP system through a beautiful collection of data flows and a lake house and a data warehouse and all that cool fabric-y stuff. This used to be my territory until I switched over to being a professor, and now someone else has taken control of it, but I still have access to it, which I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. But inside of the semantic model for this report, I've got this semantic model called fund balance model, and you can see on the right-hand side there are a bunch of tables here, dimension tables and a fact table. And up in the top toolbar, there is a cog icon and a little button that says Write DAX Queries. And if I open that up, inside of my browser, it's going to take me into a new tab where I have a live connection to that semantic model in my browser. And I can go through and say, do the same thing that I did inside Power BI Desktop a second ago. Right-click on my fund dimension, go to Quick Queries, and say, show me the top 100 rows. So these are our operating expense funds and our restricted funds and so on, professorships and scholarships, all of those things. So I can go through inside the cloud and I can look at the data that we've brought in from Oracle, and I can write queries and use these to modify my reports, I guess. I failed to mention earlier the command palette in Power BI Desktop. There's a button on the upper toolbar called Command Palette, and when I go in here, I get a command palette like you find if you've ever used Visual Studio Code, which is one of the most popular software IDEs that's currently in existence. It's just like the command palette from VS Code, and I can go through and search for something like add cursor above or cursor below. There are all these keyboard shortcuts. It's a really great way to kind of figure out the keyboard shortcuts that you need when you're editing your code. You just go in and look at add line comment and hit that, and I can comment down a line. So the command palette is a really great feature that they built into the DAX Query View that can make these kinds of scripting tasks a lot more efficient and easier to do. Um, and I can go in, and the green button down at the bottom is opening up a new query. So I can go in and create new queries from scratch. You'll also see that there's a Copilot button if you want to use Microsoft Copilot and you have a Fabric 64 SKU and your workspace is connected to that SKU and you have enabled your users to use Copilot. There's a lot of caveats there getting from point A to point B. But if you've checked all those boxes, then you can use Microsoft Copilot as well to help you write and update your DAX measures. So again, you have to be on a Fabric SKU, specifically the F64 or greater Fabric SKU, and you have to have enabled Copilot for your organization, which is not necessarily a given, but that Copilot feature is built into the DAX Query View. And if you're not familiar, if you go into your admin portal and search for Copilot, then there is an option within here where you can allow users in your organization to use Copilot. Not everyone has that feature enabled for very good reason, because not everyone wants to necessarily be using Copilot yet, or they may not trust their users to use Copilot, especially if there is a potential that they're going to use up a lot of compute credits for their Fabric SKU. So you do need to keep that in mind. But Microsoft was pretty on point with trying to embed Copilot into the DAX Query View experience, because it makes working with DAX, or it can potentially make working with DAX a lot easier. So this is a really great feature too. If you're in an organization that's working inside the Power BI cloud like we are, DAX Query View is built right in there, so that when you're working inside of your semantic model, as I am, you can go in and modify your DAX. Or if you're not familiar, you can also look at the data model itself. I've got the semantic model open here inside of the view, so you can see my star schema. And there's a bridge table too, so it's mostly star and a little snowflaked. But all this information is in the browser now, which is fantastic. I love how much functionality is now inside the Power BI service. So yeah, I will stop there. It's 1:46, and we've talked about DAX Query View. We've addressed a few questions. Um, and I'm trying to catch up. I'm looking at the chat right
Yeah, the
now.
chat's been very, very lively.
That's awesome. That's fantastic. I see questions um, about star schema best practices and complexity of measures and so forth. Um, so yeah, please someone wants to look at the fund balance report itself, or sorry. So the uh, yeah, I'm wondering if you want to look at the report, the fund balance report, or the and then let's see. Can we show how Copilot works with DAC queries? Does it autocomplete? I will weigh whether or not to show, because it's an internal Davidson College report. I'll have to consider um, what I'm able to show. But so using Copilot, that's actually so I'll give it a shot. I don't know if I didn't test this out, so we'll see if I can use it here. But I'll try using Copilot. There's so many prerequisites to using Copilot, though, that generally what James and I recommend is, if you're going to use Copilot, the better idea is to, especially if you want to use it for free, is to use it inside of Visual Studio Code and use the GitHub Copilot companion. But yeah, so Copilot, when I click the Copilot button, it gives me a little pop-up. It says ask Copilot to write or edit a DAX query or ask a related question. So let's say maybe explain a DAX topic. From these options. And let's see, my organization does not allow Copilot in this workspace. Okay, so we go back to the workspace, and let's see if I can go to Power BI.
That setting would be in your tenant settings, Pete. So um,
Oh, it's not the workspace
or
level?
at the domain level. But those are both the whether you can
Hmm.
use the Copilot in given workspaces is governed at the tenant or domain or capacity level, which is all accessed through the tenant admin panel.
Yeah. All right. So go here and so specific security groups. So it could be within domains.
Yeah, that like the domains are set up to allow like policy to be
Yeah.
applied in group to groups of workspaces rather than by individual workspaces. I
Yeah.
honestly don't think it's worth trying to make that work in this demo.
Yeah.
Um, a lot of organizations are either not going to have Fabric F64 plus capacity, which is required for Copilot in Power BI and Fabric. Um, or even if they do have such a capacity, the administrators of that capacity will have Copilot turned off because, as it turns out, Copilot, when you run it, it actually consumes compute units from that capacity, and of course, you have a limited number of compute units per daily cycle. And so, if somebody who had access to Copilot decided they just wanted to ask it a whole bunch of questions, they
Mhm.
could run out all of their capacity for the day, and then nobody could even use reports for the whole rest of the day until the compute units reset the next day. So as a tenant administrator in my organization, I don't even have Fabric F64 capacity, but when I do, I'm not going to allow Copilot to be run in my organization because I don't want to have that risk that someone's just going to have it just write a bunch of of DAX queries and just be consuming compute units without a need for it, especially when we have something like GitHub Copilot where you can actually ask it to write DAX queries for you and not consume those compute units.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really great point. And that's why, the approach with using the GitHub Copilot plugin inside Visual Studio Code um, is uh, is a really strong feature set. You have to be willing to you have to be willing to take your report and put it into the Power BI report or the Power BI project format and break it down into the uh, the Timdal and the DAX components. But once you've done that, I've seen I've seen James do a demo of this stuff before. I think it was you, but I saw someone do a demo of this um, inside VS Code, and it's a really great
Yep.
feature.
I actually just did one the other day on the drill down with Ahmed and me on LinkedIn, where we demonstrated basically using VS Code as in like a side just a separate window from Power BI where we can open the semantic model in VS Code. Because if you save your project as a PBIP, it actually saves the source code. And when you open that source code in VS Code, and then you go ask GitHub Copilot questions, it actually has access to the metadata in your model. So it knows what columns you have, what tables you have, what measures you have, the relationships between the tables, and all those things. And that's the kind of context that's required to actually get a reasonable answer out of a large language model when you ask it questions about stuff like data modeling. If you were to ask ChatGPT can't see your model. It doesn't know what your measures are. It doesn't know any of that kind of stuff. So it might just give you a sort of generic DAX stuff that it learned from its training data, but it doesn't have the context of your model to give it better like a better result like that. So I've heard that people are able to give it slightly better context by just like uploading pictures of their semantic model, like screenshots of the model view. But I'm not convinced that ChatGPT is the way to go, particularly since GitHub Copilot is free now. So it just makes a lot of sense to and honestly, most people ought to be using the PBIP format to preserve the changes and be able to look at the changes between one version and the next when you save in like a Git repository in Azure DevOps or GitHub or something like that. So
Yeah. There are other tools out there, chats, the chat window. Some people are talking about Chat GPT. I've certainly used Chat GPT for, creating DAX queries or Power Query M code, things like that. Someone points out that there is a DAX GPT bot out there, so I've got it up on the screen. I remember this popped up very quickly after ChatGPT 3.0 went live, and everyone was, losing their collective marbles over it. And then someone put this together, but I think what happened pretty soon thereafter was that Microsoft did a really good job of embedding Copilot within this entire platform. And it's potentially, removed a lot of the need for third-party AI tools, um, but in a situation like we talked about, like if you don't have a Fabric SKU, you may need to seek some alternative approaches to getting AI help with your DAX. And I've found that, ChatGPT has been, it does a pretty good job. I have to make fixes every now and then to some of the stuff that it generates for me, but by and large, it does a pretty good job. Um, Let's see, and then some questions in here. I don't know if Copilot is any better at writing DAX than other tools like DeepSeek or Chat GPT. Um,
It will be if you give it context. That's the big difference. So like
yeah,
if you're using it in VS Code where it actually has, or if you're using Power BI Desktop, if you happen to have access to the Fabric capacity, it already has access to your model metadata. And if you're using it in VS Code, again, it has access to your model's metadata. But DeepSeek or ChatGPT don't. So unless you go through the process of basically manually copy pasting your model's metadata into ChatGPT or DeepSeek, then you're not going to get that context, and the results will be worse.
yeah,
Um, so a lot of these large language models, the accuracy between one model and the next has very little, like the context of what you give it in terms of the prompt is way, 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 way more important than the actual model itself. The more context you can give in the prompt, the better your results are going to be. It's kind of like if you were to give instructions to a drunk intern, the like more specific the instructions are every single step, the more likely they are to probably get it right. If you give them sort of vague instructions, they're totally going to screw it up. So that's the way I kind of think of any of these LLMs. You kind of have to treat them like a drunk intern.
yeah. Um, we actually a week ago we were talking about doing an entire meetup, an entire hour-long meetup on the subject of AI tools with Power BI because it's not something that we've really talked about so far. But this has opened a Pandora's box of questions in the chat window. It's just so many good questions and a lot of inquisitiveness about the utility of these AI tools. Um, but I think that, over time, Copilot will get better. And I think that especially when you factor in what James said, that, it has access to all of the metadata about your report itself, the semantic model. It's potentially the much better tool to go for. And then Amin says, yeah, maybe this is part of a rationale for doing some Power BI development in VS Code for those who have not tried it. I think if you're comfortable working with Tyndall and DAX, then, and you've got your projects in a Power BI project format, which, as James said, you probably should have them in the PBIP format, then yeah, that opens the door to using VS Code to modify your stuff. Um, how reliable that will be, I'm not sure, but that's certainly something that opens up the possibility. Abby asks if we can get the recordings for today's meeting. So typically what we do, Abby, is we send out, we will upload this video to YouTube within the next 24 to 48 hours. And I will send out a message to everyone in the user group with a link to the YouTube channel so you can go back and watch this meetup if you need to. I'll also have several links in the email to some blog posts. I'm gonna include a link to the video that James did on his The Drill Down podcast.
Oh, I got it right here already. Oh, I
Sweet.
guess I needed to add the HTTPS at the beginning. Give me a sec. I'll do that.
Thank
Yeah.
you. Thank you, Peter, and thank you, James.
Absolutely.
You're very welcome.
Can
Yeah.
can I get the link actually? After 24 hours, you will be sending a message.
Yeah, with the recording won't be available right away. It has to render in Zoom on the back end. After we finish the call, it'll render, and then once it's rendered, we'll upload it, and then the link we can I think afterwards, we usually just add the YouTube link in the event description, right? Isn't that what we've
Uh,
done previously?
I haven't been doing that, but I probably
Oh,
should.
okay.
Yeah. So that's a
Or
good
maybe
idea.
we just add it. Maybe add a comment in the like below the event afterwards
Yeah.
or something like that.
Yeah.
Okay, that sounds good.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks. Good question. So yeah, it is 2 o'clock. It's 1:59. So this recording will be available in the next 24 to 48 hours, just as soon as I'm able to go through and process it and upload it to YouTube. So more to come on that. I'll send out an email to everyone with some relevant blog posts and all this stuff. So oh, more comments coming in. Fantastic meeting. Thank you, Dan. Glad to have some other North Carolinians around. Extracting data from Oracle into Fabric Data Warehouse, problems with a numeric data type. Ooh, okay, I'm going to highlight that and copy that for later as I'll look into that. I'll send it on to my colleagues in the IT department. Um, so no, Anna, I haven't stumbled into that yet, but I'm going to let my colleagues know just in case they run into that, because that's a good,
That sounds like fun.
yeah, just Oracle shenanigans in general.
I would be tempted to do some shenanigans of my own if I were running into problems like that. I would say, all right, Oracle, you want to be weird like that? Go ahead and cast that value as a varchar, max before you send it to me, and then I'll cast it back to a float on my end.
Yeah, yeah.
But
Well,
would
thanks,
it would it,
everyone.
it would be bad for performance, but it might solve that issue
Oh, yeah,
potentially.
yeah. You're right about that. All right, well, that's it, everyone. It's 2 o'clock. Thanks, everyone, for attending. Thanks for the excellent questions. Well, I may not see you at the next meetup, but James and the rest of the leadership team will.
We'll
So
be here.
thank you. Take care of yourselves and be well.